My name is Haley Thompson. I'm 27 years old, and today I'm walking away from the only family I've ever known. Standing in this driveway with two suitcases and a broken heart, I can see their faces pressed against the living room windows, watching me like I'm some kind of stranger. Behind me sits my sister's brand new BMW, with that ridiculous oversized red bow still attached to the hood. This morning they gave me the ultimate choice. Pay $45,000 for her graduation gift, or get out forever. What they didn't know was that I had been recording every conversation for the past 3 months. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt like the family scapegoat or been asked to sacrifice your dreams for someone else's happiness, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, this journey gets intense, and you won't want to miss what happens when I finally stood up for myself. Growing up in the Thompson household meant understanding your place in the family hierarchy, and mine was crystal clear from day one. While my younger sister Brianna, now 24, was treated like a precious porcelain doll, I was the workhorse, the reliable one who never complained and always delivered. From the moment she could walk, Brianna was showered with privileges that seemed as natural to my parents as breathing. Private school tuition while I attended public school, designer clothes while I shopped at thrift stores, family vacations to Europe that I couldn't afford to join because I was working double shifts at the local diner just to buy my own school supplies. My parents justified this disparity with the same refrain I heard throughout my childhood. Brianna needs more support. She's delicate and artistic. Meanwhile, I had been working since I turned 16, first at that diner, then as a grocery store cashier, and eventually putting myself through nursing school while living at home to save money. Every paycheck was carefully budgeted between my education expenses, a small contribution to household bills that my parents somehow expected, and the tiny amount I could save toward my dream of having my own apartment. Brianna's artistic nature apparently required constant financial nurturing. Piano lessons, art classes, photography equipment, and eventually enrollment in an expensive private art college that cost more per semester than I made in 6 months. When she dropped out after her freshman year, claiming the professors didn't understand her vision, my parents found ways to blame me for not being supportive enough. When she tried again at a different art school and dropped out again after 2 semesters, it was somehow my fault for not encouraging her creativity. The third time she abandoned her education, this time after just 6 weeks at an elite design institute, my parents sat me down for a serious conversation about how I needed to step up as a big sister. The pattern had become exhausting and predictable. Brianna would embark on some new passion project or educational pursuit. My parents would fund it enthusiastically. She would lose interest or face the slightest challenge. And somehow the family discussion would center around what I could have done differently to support her success. Meanwhile, I was working double shifts as an ICU nurse at the county hospital, one of the most demanding and emotionally draining jobs imaginable, while contributing $300 monthly toward household expenses and saving every other penny for a down payment on my own place. Recently, the dynamic had escalated beyond their usual favoritism into something that felt more sinister. My parents had become increasingly bold in their suggestions that I should fund more of Brianna's lifestyle choices. When she wanted to take an expensive workshop in Tuscany, they hinted that I could cover it since I never spent money on anything fun anyway. When she crashed her old Honda and needed car repairs, they suggested I could help out since I took the bus to work and clearly didn't understand transportation costs. Each request was presented as a temporary family crisis, a one-time situation where my contribution would make all the difference. What made these demands particularly galling was the way my parents had positioned themselves as generous martyrs throughout Brianna's life. They loved to tell anyone who would listen about the sacrifices they made for their artistic daughter, conveniently omitting the fact that I had been subsidizing household expenses for over 5 years while she contributed nothing. When friends or relatives praised my work ethic and independence, my parents would smile proudly and take credit for raising such a responsible daughter, as if my success was somehow their gift to Brianna rather than my own achievement. The warning signs had been mounting for months. My parents' requests for financial help had become more frequent and less apologetic. They had started talking about family money as if my income was somehow communal property, discussing my salary and savings as if they had a right to know and influence how I spent every dollar. More troubling was their increasing resentment when I dared to prioritize my own goals, like the apartment fund I had been building for 3 years. The Thursday that changed everything started innocuously enough with my mother calling me at the hospital during my break. "Honey, we're having a special family dinner tonight," she said in that artificially cheerful voice she used when she was planning something. "Can you make sure you're home by 6? We have something wonderful to celebrate with Brianna." I should have recognized the warning signs in her tone, but I was exhausted from a 12-hour shift dealing with back-to-back trauma cases and just wanted to get home, eat something, and collapse into bed. When I pulled into our driveway that evening, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting in the spot where I usually parked my 10-year-old Toyota was a gleaming white BMW sedan with an enormous red bow tied across the hood. The car was gorgeous, probably the latest model, and definitely worth more than I made in a year. For a moment, I thought maybe our neighbors had bought it and parked it in the wrong driveway, but then I saw my entire family gathered on the front porch, grinning like they had just won the lottery. "Surprise!" my mother shrieked as I got out of my car, which I had to park on the street. "Isn't it beautiful?" We wanted to celebrate Brianna's new direction in life. My father was beaming with pride, his arm around my sister's shoulders as she posed next to the car like she was in a magazine photo shoot. Brianna was practically glowing with excitement, running her hands along the pristine hood and talking rapidly about how she had always dreamed of having a car like this. I stood there in my scrubs, still smelling like hospital disinfectant, trying to process what I was seeing. Nobody had mentioned buying a car. My parents had been complaining for months about tight finances, asking me to contribute more toward groceries and utilities. Just last week, my mother had sighed dramatically about needing to put off some dental work because money was tight. Yet here was a luxury vehicle that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, wrapped up like a birthday present for my sister who had never held a steady job in her life. "What's the occasion?" I asked, genuinely confused. Brianna launched into an explanation about how she had finally found her true calling and was going to get her real estate license. Apparently, this career revelation, which had occurred to her exactly 1 week ago, warranted a celebration comparable to graduating from medical school. My parents nodded along enthusiastically, talking about how proud they were of her initiative and how this car would be essential for her new profession. As we moved inside for dinner, the conversation continued to revolve around the BMW. Brianna described every feature in detail, from the leather seats to the premium sound system, while my parents beamed at her like she had personally invented the automobile. When I asked basic questions about insurance costs and registration fees, my father waved dismissively and said they had worked everything out and I shouldn't worry about the details. It wasn't until we were halfway through my mother's pot roast that the real bombshell dropped. Of course, we had to use the family emergency fund for the down payment, my mother mentioned casually, as if she was discussing the weather. "You know how these things work, they needed something substantial up front." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth as I processed this information. The Family Emergency Fund was an account that had been established 3 years ago, supposedly for genuine crises like medical expenses or home repairs. What my mother wasn't mentioning was that 70% of that fund consisted of money I had contributed from my paychecks. The room went quiet as I set down my fork and asked the obvious question: how much was the down payment? My father cleared his throat uncomfortably and mumbled something about $15,000. $15,000 from an account that I had been paying into religiously, believing it was for actual emergencies, had been spent on a luxury car for my unemployed sister without anyone bothering to consult me. But the real shock was still coming. As my mother served dessert, my father delivered the news that would change everything. "We'll need you to cover the remaining balance, of course. It's about $45,000, but we can set up a payment plan with the dealership. After everything this family has done for you, this is your chance to really contribute something meaningful." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were asking me to drain my entire apartment savings account, take out a massive loan, and commit to years of debt to pay for a car that I had no input in choosing and would never be allowed to drive. The 3 days following the BMW revelation felt like psychological warfare. My parents had clearly coordinated their approach, taking turns cornering me with emotional manipulation that would have impressed a cult recruiter. Every conversation became an opportunity to remind me of their sacrifices, my obligations, and the devastating consequences of my selfishness if I refused to pay for Brianna's car. My mother's strategy involved dramatic crying sessions that seemed to activate the moment I walked into any room. "I just don't understand how we raised such a selfish daughter," she would sob to my father, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway. "After everything we've sacrificed, working double shifts to put food on the table and keep a roof over her head, this is how she repays us." The irony was breathtaking. I had been contributing to that roof and food for years, but somehow I was the ungrateful one for questioning their decision to spend my money without asking. My father took a more aggressive approach, cornering me in the kitchen one morning before work to deliver a lecture about family loyalty that would have been more appropriate for a crime family. "Your sister has finally found her direction in life, and instead of supporting her, you're worried about money," he said, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "That girl has been lost for years, trying to find herself, and now that she's ready to build a career, you want to hold her back over a few dollars." A few dollars. He was calling $45,000 a few dollars while I was eating ramen noodles for lunch to save money. The emotional manipulation escalated when they began involving extended family members in their campaign. My grandmother called me at work, her voice trembling with disappointment as she explained how my parents had told her about my refusal to help my sister. "Honey, family is everything," she said, and I could hear my mother coaching her in the background. "Your grandfather worked 3 jobs during the Depression to make sure his family had what they needed. The least you can do is help your sister get started in life." The conversation was clearly orchestrated, but it still hurt to hear my beloved grandmother questioning my character. Cousins, aunts, and uncles began reaching out with versions of the same message. My cousin Jennifer called to say she was disappointed but not surprised by my selfishness. My uncle Robert sent a lengthy text about family obligations and how successful people have a responsibility to lift up those who are struggling. Each message felt like a coordinated attack, and I began to realize that my parents had been busy painting me as the villain in their carefully constructed narrative. The social media warfare began when Brianna posted a series of Instagram stories about ungrateful family members who abandon you when you need them most. She never mentioned me by name, but our mutual friends and extended family knew exactly who she was targeting. The posts were accompanied by photos of herself looking sad and vulnerable, followed by glamour shots with the BMW and captions about how some people understand what family means. Each post generated dozens of supportive comments from people who had no idea what was really happening. By the second day, I had started recording conversations on my phone, initially just to document the constant harassment, but eventually because I was beginning to question my own sanity. The recordings revealed something that chilled me to the bone: my parents discussing their strategy when they thought I couldn't hear. "She's always been the reliable one," my mother was saying to my father in the living room. "We trained her well. She'll come around because she can't stand disappointing people." My father agreed, adding that they had invested too much in making her the family provider to let her start being selfish now. Those words hit me like a revelation. They had trained me, my entire childhood, of being the responsible one, the one who worked while Brianna played, the one who sacrificed while she was celebrated, hadn't been coincidence or natural family dynamics. It had been a deliberate strategy to create a reliable source of funding for their preferred child. I wasn't their daughter. I was their investment in Brianna's future. The recording that finally broke something inside me was captured on Wednesday evening when I was supposed to be at work but had come home sick. Brianna was in the kitchen with my mother, laughing about something, when my mother asked how she felt about the situation with me. "Honestly," Brianna said, her voice full of casual cruelty, "I don't know why she's being so dramatic. It's not like she has anything else to spend money on." She doesn't date, she doesn't travel, she just works and saves money like some kind of robot. She's basically just the family ATM, and ATMs don't get to have opinions about how the money gets spent. My mother's response was even worse. You're right, sweetheart. She's never been the type to have big dreams or ambitions. This is probably the most important thing she'll ever do with her money. They were discussing me like I was a resource to be managed rather than a person with feelings and goals. The casual dismissal of my entire existence, my dreams of independence, my years of sacrifice, was delivered with the same tone they might use to discuss grocery shopping. That night, they delivered the final ultimatum. My father sat me down in the living room with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence. We've been patient with you, Haley, but this situation needs to be resolved. You have until Friday evening to arrange payment for your sister's car, or you need to pack your bags and leave this house permanently. If you choose to abandon your family over money, then you're not the daughter we thought we raised, and you won't be welcome here anymore. The morning after receiving the ultimatum, I arrived at work feeling like I was drowning in quicksand. Every step toward the hospital entrance felt heavier than the last, and I realized I had been holding my breath for so long that my chest ached. My colleague Jennifer Rodriguez, a seasoned ICU nurse and mother of 2 teenagers, took one look at my face during the morning briefing and pulled me aside during our first break. "Girl, you look like someone died," she said, settling next to me in the break room with 2 cups of coffee. "What's going on?" I had worked with Jennifer for 3 years, and she had become something of a mentor to me, but I had never discussed my family situation with anyone at work. Professional boundaries had always been important to me, especially in a high-stress environment where personal drama could affect patient care. But something about her genuine concern and the way she waited patiently for me to find words broke down my defenses. When I finished explaining the BMW situation and the ultimatum, Jennifer sat in stunned silence for a full minute before speaking. "Honey, that's not family dysfunction, that's financial abuse disguised as love. What you're describing is a textbook case of parentification and economic exploitation." She went on to explain how she had seen similar patterns in her own extended family, where one child becomes the designated provider while another is enabled to remain dependent indefinitely. "Your parents didn't raise you to be responsible," she said gently. "They raised you to be responsible for them and your sister." Her validation felt like oxygen after years of suffocation, but it also terrified me. If what I was experiencing really was abusive, then my entire understanding of my family and my role in it was built on lies. Jennifer offered practical advice along with emotional support, suggesting I document everything, seek legal counsel if necessary, and most importantly, remember that I had the right to say no regardless of the consequences. "Your family is banking on your guilt and conditioning," she explained. "They know you've been trained to prioritize their needs over your own, and they're counting on that pattern to continue forever." That evening, I decided to reach out to my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister who had always seemed more rational and less caught up in family drama. Carol had been successful in her real estate career, had raised 2 independent children, and had occasionally expressed subtle concern about how my parents handled finances. If anyone in the family might understand my perspective, it would be her. I called her after dinner, explaining the situation and hoping for someone in my family to provide a voice of reason. Initially, Carol seemed sympathetic and concerned. She listened without interrupting, asked thoughtful questions about the timeline and my parents' justification for their decision, and agreed that $45,000 was an enormous amount to spring on someone without consultation. "That does seem like a lot to ask," she said carefully. "Let me talk to your mother and see if we can find some middle ground. Maybe there's a way to work this out that doesn't put such a burden on you." I felt a surge of hope that maybe, finally, someone in the family would advocate for me or at least help my parents understand how unreasonable their demands were. Carol promised to call my mother the next day and get back to me with suggestions for resolving the situation. For the first time in days, I went to sleep thinking that maybe my family crisis could be solved without destroying relationships or forcing me to choose between financial ruin and homelessness. My hope was shattered the following evening when my mother confronted me the moment I walked through the door after work. "I can't believe you would go behind our backs and try to turn the family against us," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Carol called me today, and I am absolutely disgusted that you would drag other people into our private business and try to make us look like bad parents." My stomach dropped as I realized that my aunt had not called to advocate for me, but to report my conversation back to my parents. The betrayal cut deeper than my parents' ultimatum because I had genuinely believed that Carol might be different, that somewhere in my extended family there was an adult who could see the situation objectively. Instead, she had used my vulnerability to gather information that she then shared with my parents, probably earning points for family loyalty while positioning herself as a concerned relative who was keeping an eye on the problem child. The punishment for my perceived disloyalty was swift and comprehensive. My parents changed the Wi-Fi password and refused to give me the new one, effectively cutting me off from internet access in the house. They took back the spare house key I had been given years ago, forcing me to ring the doorbell like a stranger whenever I came home from work. Meals became tense affairs where they discussed family business and future plans while pointedly excluding me from the conversation, as if I were a boarder who happened to overhear their discussions rather than their daughter. Brianna seemed to take particular pleasure in my new status as family pariah. She began bringing friends over to see her car, loudly discussing how some people just don't understand what family means, while I was within earshot. She would take long drives around the neighborhood, honking the horn as she passed my bedroom window and posting Instagram stories about how grateful she was for parents who believed in her dreams. Each post felt like salt in an open wound, especially when I saw relatives and family friends commenting with heart emojis and congratulations. The only bright spot in this nightmare came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor who lived alone in the house next to ours. She had been widowed 5 years ago and had always been friendly but never intrusive. On Thursday afternoon, as I sat on the front steps trying to get some fresh air before facing another evening of family hostility, she approached me with a concerned expression. "Honey, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I've been watching what's going on over here, and I'm worried about you," she said, settling carefully on the step beside me. "That girl has been showing off that fancy car all week, and your parents keep talking about how proud they are, but I haven't seen anyone congratulating you for anything. In fact, you look more miserable every day." Her observation was so simple and yet so validating that I almost started crying right there on the steps. Mrs. Rodriguez went on to share her perspective as someone who had raised 4 children on a modest income. "In my day, parents sacrificed for their children, not the other way around. If my husband and I had ever asked one of our kids to go into debt to buy something nice for their sibling, our own parents would have disowned us. What your family is asking of you isn't normal, and it's not right." Her words carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom, and they helped me realize that my feelings weren't the result of selfishness or ingratitude, but of legitimate injustice. That night, I began systematically documenting everything. I took photographs of text messages, saved voicemails, and organized the recordings I had been making. I also started researching my legal rights and discovered that in our state, adult children have no legal obligation to support their parents or siblings financially, regardless of family pressure or emotional manipulation. Most importantly, I realized that I needed to start moving my money and important documents to places where my family couldn't access or monitor them. Thursday night arrived with the weight of an execution countdown. I had less than 24 hours before my family's ultimatum expired, and the house felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. As I walked through the front door after my shift, I could hear voices in the living room and realized that my parents had assembled what could only be described as a family intervention. Sitting around our coffee table were my grandparents, 2 of my cousins, my Uncle Robert, and several family friends who had known me since childhood. My mother stood up as I entered the room, her face wearing that artificially sympathetic expression she used when she was about to deliver devastating news wrapped in concern. "Sweetheart, we're all here because we love you and we're worried about the path you're choosing," she began, gesturing for me to sit in the single chair they had positioned facing the group like I was about to be interrogated. We've all been talking about this situation, and everyone agrees that you're making a terrible mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life. What followed was 2 hours of the most sophisticated emotional manipulation I had ever experienced. Each person took turns explaining why I owed this sacrifice to Brianna, speaking as if my obligation was so obvious that my resistance could only be explained by temporary insanity or moral deficiency. My grandfather, whom I had always adored, spoke about the importance of family legacy and how disappointed he was to see me choosing money over blood. My cousin Lisa, who had received substantial family support for her own business ventures, lectured me about gratitude and responsibility to those less fortunate. The most painful moment came when Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor who had watched me grow up, spoke about how proud she had always been of my work ethic and independence, but how concerned she was now about my apparent selfishness. "I always told your mother what a wonderful daughter she had," Mrs. Patterson said, shaking her head sadly. "But I never imagined you would abandon your family when they needed you most. Your sister is finally ready to build a life for herself, and you want to sabotage that over money." Brianna herself delivered what was clearly a rehearsed performance, complete with tears and voice trembling with emotion. She spoke about feeling worthless and directionless for years, about how this car represented more than transportation, but finally being valued and believed in by my family. She talked about her dreams of building a successful real estate career and how my refusal to help was essentially destroying her chance at independence and self-sufficiency. "I know I haven't always been the easiest sister," she said, looking directly at me with tears streaming down her face. "But I thought we were family, and family helps each other succeed." My grandmother, the woman who had taught me to bake cookies and helped me with homework throughout elementary school, delivered the most devastating blow. "Your grandfather worked 3 jobs during the Depression so that his children could have better lives," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "We never had much, but we always shared what we had. I don't understand how I could have a granddaughter who has so much but is willing to give so little. What would your grandfather think if he could see you now?" As the intervention continued, I realized that my family had created a narrative where I was the villain in Brianna's story rather than a separate person with my own dreams and financial needs. Every argument centered around what I owed to others, what my responsibilities were to the family, and how my refusal to comply with their demands revealed fundamental character flaws. Nobody asked about my own goals, my years of sacrifice, or whether I might have valid reasons for wanting to keep the money I had worked so hard to save. When it was finally my turn to speak, I pulled out my phone and showed them the bank statements I had printed that afternoon. The documents clearly showed my contributions to the household emergency fund, the monthly payments I had been making toward family expenses, and the stark contrast between my financial responsibility and Brianna's complete lack of contribution. "I've been supporting this family for 5 years," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've contributed over $30,000 to household expenses while Brianna has contributed nothing. I've been saving for my own apartment while helping pay for groceries, utilities, and family emergencies. Now you want me to give up my entire future so she can have a luxury car for a job she might quit in 6 months." The reaction to my presentation was explosive and revealing. Instead of acknowledging the numbers or recognizing the pattern of financial exploitation they documented, my family became furious that I had dared to keep score and reduce family relationships to cold calculations. My father accused me of being manipulative and calculating, as if documenting years of financial abuse was somehow worse than the abuse itself. My mother cried harder and talked about how hurt she was that I had been secretly resenting my contributions instead of giving freely from the heart. Brianna's response was the most telling of all. She completely melted down, screaming that I was jealous and trying to ruin everything, and that I had always been jealous of the attention she received. She accused me of keeping a ledger like some kind of accountant instead of loving my family unconditionally. The mask of vulnerability she had worn during her earlier speech completely disappeared, replaced by rage that I had dared to question the family dynamics that benefited her. In a final desperate attempt at manipulation, my parents offered what they presented as a generous compromise. Look, we understand this is a lot of money, my father said, his tone suggesting he was being incredibly reasonable. But we can work something out. You can live in the basement indefinitely, rent-free, if you help us with this one thing. Think about it as an investment in your housing situation. The offer was presented as if they were doing me a favor, ignoring the fact that the basement was unfinished, had no proper bathroom, and would essentially trap me in their house forever as an unpaid servant. The evening reached its lowest point when my father delivered what he clearly thought was the ultimate truth. At least Brianna brings joy to this family. She's artistic and creative and fun to be around. What do you bring besides money? The question hung in the air like a physical assault. After 27 years of being the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who never caused problems or asked for anything, my father had reduced my entire value to the family to my paycheck. That moment crystallized everything I had been struggling to understand about my family dynamics. I wasn't their daughter. I was their financial resource. I wasn't loved for who I was, but for what I could provide. And if I stopped providing, I would be discarded without hesitation or remorse. The realization was both devastating and liberating because it meant that I wasn't actually losing a loving family by choosing to leave. I was simply accepting the reality that love had never been part of the equation. That night, after the family intervention finally ended and everyone went home shaking their heads at my stubbornness, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling and planning my escape. The decision had crystallized during my father's question about what I brought to the family besides money. If my only value was financial, then removing myself would simply be a business decision rather than the destruction of loving family relationships. I had been secretly moving my most important possessions to Jennifer's house throughout the week, but I needed to accelerate the timeline and ensure that my family couldn't access my money or sabotage my plans out of spite. The next morning, during my lunch break at the hospital, I opened a new bank account at a different institution and arranged for my direct deposit to be transferred immediately. I also gathered all my important documents: birth certificate, social security card, passport, and medical records, and placed them in a safety deposit box that only I could access. Jennifer had offered her family's spare room indefinitely, and her husband Miguel had even helped move my furniture and boxes during the evenings when my family thought I was working late. Their teenage daughters, Sophia and Carmen, had been excited about having a big sister around and had already cleared space in their shared bathroom for my toiletries. The generosity and warmth of this family, who had known me for only 3 years, stood in stark contrast to the conditional and manipulative love I had experienced from my own relatives. The most important part of my preparation involved securing legal protection and professional guidance. During my lunch break on Thursday, I had consulted with an employment lawyer who specialized in financial abuse cases. She confirmed that what my family was doing constituted economic coercion and that I had every right to protect my assets and remove myself from the situation. She also prepared a cease and desist letter that would prevent my family from harassing me at work or spreading false information about my character to my colleagues. Even more importantly, my head nurse, Dr. Martinez, had approached me that morning with an unexpected opportunity. The hospital system was opening a new trauma center across town and needed an experienced ICU nurse to help train staff and establish protocols. The position came with a significant salary increase, relocation assistance, and the chance to work with cutting-edge equipment and procedures. Dr. Martinez had recommended me for the role specifically because of my clinical skills and reliability, and the timing felt like a sign that I was making the right choice. By Thursday afternoon, my family was becoming desperate as they realized I wasn't bluffing about my refusal to pay for the BMW. My mother kept trying to engage me in conversations about compromise solutions and payment plans that would spread the financial burden over several years. She suggested I could take out a personal loan, use credit cards, or even sell some of my possessions to raise the money. Each suggestion was presented as if she was being incredibly helpful and creative, but they all led to the same outcome: me sacrificing my financial future for Brianna's immediate gratification. My father's approach was more directly threatening. He began mentioning how difficult it would be for me to find another place to live on short notice, how expensive apartments were in our area, and how unlikely it was that I could qualify for a lease without a substantial savings account for deposits and moving expenses. He clearly assumed that the practical challenges of leaving would force me to capitulate, but his threats only strengthened my resolve. Every obstacle he mentioned was something I had already researched and planned for with Jennifer's help. The most disturbing development was my family's attempt to stage a medical emergency with my grandmother to guilt me into staying. On Thursday evening, my cousin called in hysterics to say that grandmother had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains and was asking for me. I dropped everything and raced to the emergency room, my heart pounding with genuine fear and guilt that our family conflict might have affected her health. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my grandmother sitting up in bed, looking perfectly fine and somewhat confused about why I was there. After speaking with her privately, I realized that my parents had asked her to act weak and worried so that I would be reminded of family obligations and the importance of staying close to home. My grandmother was embarrassed and apologetic when she understood how she had been manipulated, and she quietly told me that she didn't actually support my parents' demands. "Honey, when I was your age, my parents would have been horrified if they had asked me to pay for my brother's automobile," she whispered. "This isn't how families are supposed to work." The fake emergency was a wake-up call about how far my parents were willing to go to manipulate me. If they were prepared to use my elderly grandmother's health as a weapon in their campaign, then there was no limit to the tactics they might employ if I stayed and continued to resist their demands. That night, I finalized my packing and prepared for the confrontation I knew was coming. The most difficult part of my preparation was emotional rather than logistical. I had to accept that choosing to leave meant accepting that my family relationships were fundamentally broken and probably beyond repair. This wasn't a temporary conflict that could be resolved with compromise and communication. It was the culmination of 27 years of dysfunction that had been disguised as normal family dynamics. Leaving meant acknowledging that my parents had never seen me as a complete person with my own needs and dreams, and that insight was both liberating and heartbreaking. As I lay in my childhood bed for what I knew would be the last time, I thought about all the things I would miss about family life and all the things I was eager to leave behind. I would miss my grandmother's Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, but I wouldn't miss being treated like a walking ATM. I would miss the security of having a place to come home to, but I wouldn't miss the constant guilt and manipulation that made that home feel like a prison. Most importantly, I realized that I was ready to discover who I could become when I wasn't constantly managing other people's emotions and financing their dreams at the expense of my own. Friday morning arrived with an autumn crispness that seemed to sharpen every detail of what I knew would be one of the most important days of my life. I had barely slept, but adrenaline was keeping me alert and focused as I prepared for the confrontation that would either free me or destroy the last remnants of my family relationships. I dressed carefully in my best jeans and a sweater, wanting to look composed and confident rather than defensive or apologetic. My family was already gathered in the living room when I came downstairs with my 2 large suitcases, apparently expecting some kind of dramatic capitulation where I would beg for forgiveness and agree to their terms. My mother was sitting in her favorite chair with a checkbook and a stack of dealership paperwork, ready to finalize the BMW payment the moment I agreed to their demands. My father stood by the window looking grim and determined, while Brianna lounged on the sofa scrolling through her phone with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted that she would get what she wanted. The sight of my suitcases created an immediate stir of confusion and concern. My mother stood up quickly, her face going pale as she realized that I might actually be serious about leaving. "Honey, what are those for?" she asked, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone she used when she was trying to de-escalate a situation she had created. "Are you going somewhere for the weekend? We need to resolve this car situation first." I set the suitcases down in the entryway and turned to face my family with as much dignity as I could muster. "I'm not paying for the car," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. "And I'm moving out today. Permanently." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and I could see each family member processing the information at different speeds. My father was the first to respond, his face flushing red with anger and disbelief. "You're being ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "This is just a tantrum because you're not getting your way. Put those bags back upstairs and let's discuss this like adults." He seemed genuinely convinced that my decision was an elaborate bluff designed to extract better terms rather than a sincere choice to remove myself from their manipulation. Brianna's reaction was immediate and explosive. She jumped up from the sofa, her face contorting with rage, and began screaming about how I was ruining everything and destroying the family over money. She tried to grab one of my suitcases, as if physically preventing me from taking my belongings would somehow force me to change my mind. When I held onto the handle, she began hitting my arms and trying to open the zipper, apparently believing she could destroy my ability to leave by scattering my possessions. It was at that moment that I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings I had made earlier in the week. My parents' voices filled the room, discussing how they had trained me well to be the family provider and how I would come around because she can't stand disappointing people. The sound of their own words seemed to shock them into silence, and I could see the realization dawning that their private conversations hadn't been as private as they thought. The reaction to hearing their own voices was swift and revealing. Instead of acknowledging the cruel and manipulative nature of their comments, my parents became furious that I had been recording them. "How dare you spy on us in our own home," my mother said, her voice shaking with outrage. "This is a complete violation of trust and privacy. What kind of daughter secretly records her own family?" The irony was stunning. They were more upset about being documented than about the behavior the documentation revealed. My father demanded that I delete the recordings immediately, threatening to call the police if I didn't comply. "You have no right to record private conversations without permission," he said, though I had researched the legality and knew that recording conversations in common areas of a home where I lived was perfectly legal. His threats only confirmed that he understood exactly how damaging those recordings would be if other people heard them. As the argument escalated, our commotion began drawing attention from the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at her front window, clearly concerned about the shouting and chaos. Other neighbors emerged from their houses or slowed down while walking their dogs, drawn by Brianna's screaming and my parents' increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to return to the house. The public nature of our conflict seemed to humiliate my parents, who prided themselves on maintaining the appearance of a perfect family. The situation took a dramatic turn when Brianna's attempts to destroy my suitcases became physical assault. She began hitting me with closed fists, trying to knock me down so she could prevent me from leaving with my belongings. When I defended myself by holding her wrists to stop the blows, she began screaming that I was attacking her and that someone should call the police. The irony was perfect. She was calling for law enforcement intervention while actively assaulting me. Mrs. Rodriguez had apparently reached the same conclusion because within minutes, 2 police officers arrived to investigate reports of a domestic disturbance. Officer Martinez, a veteran cop who had clearly seen this kind of family dysfunction before, listened patiently as my parents tried to explain that I was having a mental breakdown and threatening the family by refusing to pay for my sister's car. Their explanation sounded as absurd as it was, and the officer's expression suggested he was having trouble understanding why adults were calling the police about financial disagreements. When Brianna demanded that the officers arrest me for stealing family money, Officer Martinez asked to see documentation of any theft. Of course, there was none because I had never taken money that didn't belong to me. My bank statements clearly showed that every dollar in my possession had been earned through my own work, and the family emergency fund my parents had raided consisted largely of money I had contributed voluntarily. The officer's assessment of the situation was swift and professional. He explained to my family that adult children have no legal obligation to financially support their parents or siblings, that I had every right to leave my family's home with my personal belongings, and that preventing me from doing so could constitute unlawful imprisonment. He also noted that the recordings on my phone, while potentially hurtful to family relationships, were completely legal since they were made in common areas of my own residence. The moment that will stay with me forever came when Officer Martinez asked my family a simple question: is there any reason this young lady shouldn't be allowed to leave with her own belongings and live wherever she chooses? The silence that followed was deafening because there was no legitimate answer. My parents and sister had no legal authority over me, no financial claim on my possessions, and no right to prevent me from making my own life choices. As I loaded my suitcases into Jennifer's car, which had arrived right on schedule, my family stood in the doorway hurling final threats and accusations. My mother screamed that I was dead to them and would never be welcome in this house again. My father shouted that I was making the biggest mistake of my life and would come crawling back within a month. Brianna's final contribution was to scream that I was jealous and pathetic and that the family was better off without me. The last thing I saw as Jennifer drove away was my parents and sister standing in the driveway, still shouting, while neighbors watched from their yards with expressions ranging from concern to embarrassment. Mrs. Rodriguez caught my eye through the car window and nodded approvingly, giving me a small wave that felt like a blessing from the only person in the neighborhood who had seen through my family's performance. As we turned the corner and my childhood home disappeared from view, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the absence of guilt. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about disappointing someone, managing someone else's emotions, or funding someone else's dreams. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. The first week of my new life felt like learning to breathe underwater. Every morning I woke up in Jennifer's guest room expecting to feel the familiar weight of family obligations and financial demands, but instead I found myself in a house where my presence was appreciated rather than exploited. Miguel would knock gently on my door each morning to let me know coffee was ready, and their daughters Sophia and Carmen would chatter excitedly about their school days over breakfast, treating me like a welcome addition to their family rather than a burden to be managed. The contrast between the Rodriguez family dynamics and what I had grown up believing was normal was stark and educational. When 15-year-old Carmen mentioned wanting a car for her 16th birthday, Miguel and Jennifer discussed saving strategies and the importance of Carmen contributing through part-time work and good grades. Nobody suggested that Sophia should sacrifice her college fund to buy her sister a vehicle, and nobody treated Carmen's desire as an emergency requiring immediate family mobilization. It was a revelation to witness healthy boundaries and age-appropriate expectations in action. Meanwhile, my biological family had launched into full crisis mode without their primary source of financial support. My mother began calling my workplace repeatedly, trying to reach me with increasingly desperate messages about family emergencies that required my immediate attention and financial assistance. When the hospital administration blocked her calls at my request, she began showing up at the employee parking garage, waiting by my car with tearful pleas for reconciliation that always circled back to the BMW payment. The social media campaign against me reached new heights of creativity and manipulation. Brianna posted a series of Instagram stories showing herself looking forlorn and abandoned, with captions about family betrayal and ungrateful siblings. She shared old photos of us together as children, writing lengthy paragraphs about how I had changed and become selfish and money-obsessed. The posts generated hundreds of comments from extended family members and family friends, most of whom had only heard my family's version of events and naturally sympathized with the apparent victim. What my family hadn't anticipated was how quickly their financial house of cards would collapse without my contributions. The BMW payments they had assumed I would cover became immediately unmanageable when added to their existing expenses. Within 2 weeks, they were behind on the car payment, and the dealership was sending threatening notices about repossession. My parents began reaching out to extended family members for loans, spinning increasingly elaborate stories about temporary setbacks and promising quick repayment once I came to my senses. The legal intervention I had prepared proved necessary sooner than expected. My family's harassment escalated to the point where my lawyer filed a cease and desist order, formally demanding that they stop contacting me at work, spreading false information about my character, and attempting to access my financial accounts. The legal documentation of their behavior was sobering even to me, as I saw in black and white the pattern of abuse and manipulation that had characterized my adult relationship with my family. The most shocking development came when my parents attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could access my savings account to pay for Brianna's car. They contacted a lawyer with stories about my sudden personality change and irrational decision-making, claiming that my refusal to support family members was evidence of a psychological breakdown requiring legal intervention. The attorney they consulted apparently explained that financial independence and boundary setting are not grounds for competency hearings, but the fact that they had even attempted such a strategy revealed the depths of their desperation and entitlement. Dr. Martinez, my supervisor at the hospital, proved to be an invaluable ally during this period. When my parents showed up at the hospital claiming there was a family emergency requiring my immediate attention, she calmly assessed the situation and determined that it was harassment rather than a legitimate crisis. She also provided a professional evaluation of my mental health and job performance for my legal documentation, noting that I had consistently demonstrated excellent judgment, emotional stability, and professional competence throughout the crisis period. The stalking behavior escalated when my father began following me to work and showing up at places where I regularly shopped or exercised. He would approach me in public places, sometimes with tears in his eyes, begging me to reconsider my decision and return to the family. These encounters were humiliating and frightening, especially when he began raising his voice and attracting attention from other customers and employees. The final straw came when he appeared at the hospital during my shift, demanding that security allow him access to speak with me about a family emergency. The restraining order I obtained was comprehensive and necessary. The court documentation included recordings of threatening voicemails, photographs of my father's car parked outside my workplace, and witness statements from colleagues who had observed the harassment. The judge who issued the order noted that financial coercion combined with stalking and workplace harassment constituted a clear pattern of abuse that warranted legal protection. Jennifer's family continued to be a source of stability and wisdom during this chaotic period. Miguel, who had grown up in an immigrant family where children were expected to contribute financially, helped me understand that there was a significant difference between appropriate family support and exploitation. In my family, we all helped each other, he explained, but it was reciprocal and voluntary. Nobody was designated as the permanent provider for everyone else's dreams. The community support I received was overwhelming and healing. Hospital colleagues rallied around me with offers of furniture, household items, and emotional support. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by Jennifer's house regularly with homemade meals and gentle encouragement. Even some of my extended family members, after learning more details about the situation, quietly reached out to express their support for my decision. The turning point came when the BMW was finally repossessed 6 weeks after I left home. Brianna posted a dramatic video on social media, crying in the driveway where the car used to be parked, talking about how her dreams had been destroyed by family selfishness. The video backfired when several people who watched it questioned why a 24-year-old woman couldn't buy her own car and why her sister's refusal to pay for a luxury vehicle was being treated as a betrayal rather than a reasonable boundary. The repossessions seemed to break something in my family's narrative. Without the BMW as a symbol of their success and generosity, they were forced to confront the reality of their financial situation and their unsustainable dependence on my income. My parents began having marital conflicts about money management and blame for the current crisis, while Brianna moved back into her childhood bedroom, unemployed and angry that her guaranteed lifestyle had evaporated. 6 months after walking away from my family home with 2 suitcases and a broken heart, I stood in the living room of my own apartment, watching the morning sunlight stream through windows that I had chosen and could decorate however I pleased. The one-bedroom unit was modest, but perfect for my needs, with a modern kitchen where I could cook meals for myself without calculating family contributions and a bathroom where my toiletries weren't constantly moved to make room for someone else's preferences. The financial freedom I experienced for the first time in my adult life was revolutionary. Without the constant drain of family obligations and emergency contributions, my nursing salary was more than adequate for comfortable independent living. I had money for groceries I actually wanted to eat, clothes that fit properly and reflected my personal style, and even small luxuries like books and streaming services that I had denied myself for years while prioritizing family needs. My career had flourished beyond my wildest expectations. The trauma center position had challenged me professionally and personally, and my success in training new staff and establishing protocols had led to additional opportunities for leadership and advancement. Dr. Martinez had become a mentor and advocate, nominating me for advanced certification programs and professional development opportunities that would have been impossible while I was managing constant family crises and financial demands. The relationships I built during this period of growth were fundamentally different from what I had experienced within my family structure. Jennifer and her family had become chosen family, people who appreciated my contributions without expecting them and who supported my goals without trying to redirect them toward their own benefit. We celebrated each other's successes genuinely, without the undercurrent of resentment and competition that had characterized my relationships with my parents and sister. The romantic relationship that developed with David, a respiratory therapist at the trauma center, felt like discovering a new language. He valued my intelligence, work ethic, and compassion without seeing them as resources to be exploited. When I told him about my family situation, his response was immediate support rather than pressure to reconcile or suggestions that I should compromise my boundaries for the sake of family harmony. Dating someone who respected my autonomy and celebrated my independence was a revelation after years of being valued primarily for my financial contributions. My family's situation had continued to deteriorate without their designated provider. My parents' marriage was struggling under financial pressure and the blame they assigned each other for their current predicament. They had been forced to downsize their living situation, moving to a smaller rental property and taking on additional debt to maintain even a reduced version of their previous lifestyle. Brianna had eventually found employment in retail, a job that apparently provided regular reality checks about the value of money and the effort required to earn it. The attempts at reconciliation began tentatively about 4 months after I left, starting with my grandmother who served as an intermediary. She had been horrified to learn the full extent of what had transpired and had apparently delivered some harsh truths to my parents about their treatment of me. Her first message was simple and sincere, an apology for her role in the family intervention and an acknowledgement that she had been wrong to pressure me about financial obligations to my sister. My grandmother's apology opened a door to selective healing. I began visiting her once a week, enjoying our conversations about her childhood, her marriage, and her perspective on family relationships that had been shaped by the Depression and World War II. She shared stories about her own struggles with difficult family members and her regrets about times when she had prioritized keeping peace over standing up for what was right. These visits became precious to me, representing the possibility of maintaining meaningful family connections without sacrificing my autonomy or financial security. The breakthrough with my sister came unexpectedly and in a form I hadn't anticipated. Brianna reached out through a mutual friend, requesting a meeting to apologize for her behavior and to discuss our relationship without the influence of our parents. When we met at a neutral coffee shop, I was surprised to find that she had genuinely reflected on the family dynamics and her role in perpetuating them. Working in retail had apparently provided her first real experience with earning money and managing expenses, giving her perspective on the value of the contributions I had made over the years. Her apology was specific and heartfelt, acknowledging not just the BMW incident but years of taking my sacrifices for granted and participating in the family narrative that portrayed me as selfish when I dared to prioritize my own needs. She had also begun therapy to address what she recognized as entitlement and dependency issues that had been enabled by our parents' differential treatment. While our relationship was still fragile and tentative, her willingness to take responsibility for her actions opened the possibility of rebuilding some kind of sisterly connection based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. My parents' approach to reconciliation was more complex and less satisfactory. Their initial attempts focused on practical matters, suggesting that we could put the past behind us and return to family dinners and holiday celebrations without addressing the fundamental issues that had caused the crisis. When I insisted that any relationship would require acknowledgement of their financial abuse and concrete changes in how they treated me, they became defensive and angry, falling back into familiar patterns of blame and manipulation. The career advancement that crowned this period of personal growth was an offer to become the ICU supervisor at the city's most prestigious hospital, a position that came with significant salary increase, comprehensive benefits, and the opportunity to shape patient care protocols for the entire department. Accepting the position felt like claiming my professional identity fully for the first time, no longer viewing my success as a means to support others, but as an achievement in its own right. The final conversation with my parents came 8 months after I left home, when they requested a family meeting to discuss moving forward. I agreed to meet them at a restaurant, neutral territory where their ability to manipulate the environment was limited. They had apparently been coached, possibly by a counselor or mediator, because their approach was more measured than their previous attempts at reconciliation. They acknowledged that they had made mistakes in how they handled the BMW situation and admitted that their expectations had been unreasonable. However, their apology was limited and conditional, focusing on specific incidents rather than addressing the broader pattern of exploitation that had characterized our relationship throughout my adult life. When I explained that rebuilding trust would require ongoing demonstration of respect for my boundaries and autonomy, they seemed willing to commit to change without truly understanding what that change would entail. The peace I eventually found wasn't the result of perfect family reconciliation, but of accepting that love doesn't require unlimited sacrifice. I learned to distinguish between family members who were willing to grow and change, and those who simply wanted me to return to my former role as financial provider and emotional caretaker. The relationships I chose to maintain became healthier because they were based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. Looking back on the day I walked away from my family's ultimatum, I realized that what I initially thought would destroy me had actually saved me. Losing the toxic version of family I had known created space for authentic relationships based on genuine care and respect. The fear of disappointing others that had controlled my decisions for years was replaced by commitment to living authentically and prioritizing my own well-being alongside consideration for others. The final reflection that brought me peace was understanding that real family doesn't come with price tags, ultimatums, or conditions. The people who truly love you will celebrate your success, support your dreams, and respect your boundaries. They will ask for your help when they need it, but they won't demand your sacrifice as proof of your love. Most importantly, they will value you for who you are, not what you can provide. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own financial future? Have you been the designated family provider, expected to sacrifice your dreams for someone else's happiness? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding the courage to put yourself first. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics, because sometimes we all need to be reminded that our worth isn't measured by what we're willing to give up for others. Thank you for watching, and remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary for building the life you deserve. Until next time, take care of yourselves and know that you are worthy of relationships that lift you up rather than drain you dry.